All right, thanks everyone for coming to our talk. It's great to be here in person after all these years. My name is Madhura Bhave, and I work on the Spring team.
My name is Phil Webb. I also work on the Spring team. Before we get going, we've got a disclaimer slide, so please read that. And please also excuse my voice. It's starting to disappear a little bit, so hopefully as I talk, it'll come back. All right, before we get going, I guess we ought to start with a definition of what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to define the treasure in the title of this talk, Little Treasures. And to do that, we're going to have to go back 20 years and have a think about what was going on then when a bunch of consultants sat down at what I imagine a computer looked like 20 years ago and worked on a new framework, had an idea for it, and called it Spring. And they started developing this framework. They started adding classes. And at some point, they found that there was sort of common patterns, things that they needed to reuse. And so they had to have a think about what they wanted to do about that. And they had a few choices. They could just copy-paste that code, which is bad. They could use something like Apache Commons, but we don't want to have a framework depend on other libraries unnecessarily. So they chose a third option, which is to take that code, extract it, and create more code. So Utils classes, for instance. If we fast forward now 20 years future, what I imagine a computer looks like today, we have a bunch of these classes and utilities that we're going to talk about today. So these are things that Framework has developed that you can use that you may or may not know about. When we talk about these utilities, obviously they've been developed pretty much exclusively for Spring itself. They're things that while Spring was being developed, these classes were needed and these utilities were needed. But there is like a big overlap often between your apps. So stuff that was useful for us is likely also useful for you. And what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to have a demo application, and we've tried to stuff in as much of the Utils classes into this demo application so that we can show you things. There's also some stuff at the end which we may or may not have time for that's kind of more framework specific. It's interesting, but you probably won't need it in your own apps directly. And then finally, there's stuff that we haven't developed that you might need. And I want to point out that the stuff that's in Spring is pretty much only for Spring. So if you want like utility methods adding, you are unlikely to get pull requests accepted unless we need that functionality ourselves. We're not trying to be a kind of general purpose Guava type library, for example. A little disclaimer as well, the demo app is like very daft. We've designed the app to show you the utils, so don't write your apps this way. There are many, many ways of doing things, so you're free to choose alternatives. We're just trying to show you stuff that you might find useful, but if you want to use another library, go ahead. Java is also evolving, so remember some of this stuff started 20 years ago, and there may be things in the JDK now that offer alternatives that you also might want to consider.
Okay, so let's talk about the demo app a little bit before we jump into the code. As Phil mentioned, we've written this app so that we can demo most of the utils that we want to talk about today. You're probably not going to end up using so many of them, but because we wanted to demo them, we've put them there. It's a simple REST application that shows you hotels on the Las Vegas Strip, because that's where we are. You can, there's an API to get all the hotels. You can get a hotel by name, or you can get hotels by geographic order. That means whether the hotel is on the south of the strip, north of the strip, center strip, etc. We have a YAML file, which has the data about the hotels, which is taken from Wikipedia. And there's an API which can give you thumbnail images for those hotels in JPEG format. And the last thing I'll mention here is that it's written in Spring Boot 3.1, which is the latest generally available release of Spring Boot. Spring Boot 3.2 is still in milestone phase. You might have seen some people use it in other talks, and it's going to be available, generally available in November of this year. And the last thing about the demo application before we actually switch to code is that we have this requirement from our IT department that all production applications must print out auth when started with com.example production equals true. Of course, it's a made-up requirement, so we can show you some of the cool utilities. Okay, so I'll start with the pom.xml. If most of you are Spring Boot users, you're probably already familiar with this. We have Spring Boot 3.1.2 in here using Java 17, and we're using the Spring Boot Starter Web and Spring Boot Starter test dependencies. If we look at the main application class, it's again the familiar Spring Boot application annotated with Spring Boot application, and we have a main method. The startup class is the one that's going to print out that auth requirement that we have from IT. It has this one method which prints it out, and the code is pretty simple. This boolean.getBoolean, even though it's not a Spring hidden treasure, I suppose it's worth mentioning over here because it's a useful class available or useful method available in the JDK to see if there's a system property set to true. And if it is set to true, then we want to do a system.out with auth. So as you can see, the main code here or the production code here is pretty straightforward to do this, but how would you test this? If you were to test this manually, you might imagine doing something like this, where you create a byte array output stream, create a new print stream from that, save the existing system.out print stream in a temporary variable, then you set the newly created print stream to system.out, and then you set the system property because it needs to be true, and then you have to clear all the properties, you have to set it back to the previous system.out, and then you can assert on whatever you need to assert. But with the utilities the test utilities that Spring Boot provides, you don't need to do any of that. It's pretty straightforward, the code that you need to write in order to set some system properties and verify that something is getting printed. So there's two things that we need to do in our tests over here. We need to set up a system property, and we need to make sure that the auth little treasure is printed. So in order to set up the system property, there's a class called test property values in Spring Boot. You can set it up with a bunch of key value pairs. In our case, it's com.example.production set to true. And then you can apply that to system properties and run it with a callable, after which the system property will be automatically cleared for you. So you don't need to mess around with any of the clearing of system properties once your test has run. And then in order to be able to assert that the string that you wanted to be printed out is printed, we have this class called output capture extension, which is a JUnit 5 extension that lets you capture system.out and system.error. And you can use it along with this captured output parameter, which is basically a char sequence that you can then use in your assertions to make sure that the right stuff gets printed. And I'll switch back to the slides here.
Okay, so for each of these little, the way this presentation is going to go is we're going to look at some code, and then I'm going to give a quick recap of what we've just seen. So starting with that output capture extension, hidden treasure number 1, it's a JUnit 5 extension, but if you're on JUnit 4, you can use an alternative one called the output capture rule. You can use the assert that method directly on it because it's a char sequence. So if you're using assert j, you can just pass it in, and it's quite easy to use that way. Or you can call the getOut or getAll or getter methods on it, which will give you the individual out or error or combined results. And it takes care of that cleanup that we saw in the manual code automatically when the JUnit test ends. And hidden treasure 2 that we saw was the test property values class. I should say both of these are in Spring Boot's codebase. They're in the Spring Boot test module. And test property values allows you to quickly build up, test property values, and then you can apply them to certain things. So you can say, I have a bunch of values, and I want to apply them to, for example, a Spring environment, or an application context, or you can use the apply to system properties method to apply them to your actual system properties. And again, it takes care of the kind of cleanup so that you don't have to worry about doing that. You can call callable or runnable actions, and if you do a callable, it will return the result for you as well.
Okay, so we have this YAML file that we talked about a little before. So apparently the project manager has given us data in YAML, and it's a humongous YAML file, which we then want to use the data from that in order to return it from our REST API. So how do we load this file and make it easy for the rest of the application to use? Some of you might have already guessed it, but let's get back to the code and see how we can do that. Okay, so let's look at the YAML file first before we look at how we're using it. So it's called hotels.yaml. The structure of the file is pretty simple. It has a version number, and then it has a list of hotels in here, which each of which has a name, address, image, rooms, etc., architects. And in order to be able to use and load that YAML file, because let's say we don't want to use, as application developers, we don't want to deal with YAML and we want to use properties files, you can do that using spring.config.import, and you can just tell it to import your hotels.yaml and then use your application.properties in order to configure any of the other properties that you want to configure for your Spring Boot application. So that's how Spring Boot knows to load this file and make properties from that available in the Spring environment. And once we have those properties available in the Spring environment, we can use configuration properties, which some of you might be familiar with. And the prefix we're using is treasures, because that's what the YAML file has nested under. We have support for Java records now, and then we can create a hotel properties object from hotel properties bean from that YAML file. Let's take a look at this record for hotel. It's pretty simple. It has all of the parameters that we saw in the YAML file for the name, address, image, etc. So all of that data will now be available for like a service or the controller to use. And I think that's it for the YAML.
So just to recap again, configuration properties, that annotation is something that we use extensively within Spring Boot, but it's really handy if you want to have some type of typed configuration or import of data in your own applications, and you can just annotate any class with it. You can bind to both Java beans, and you can bind to immutable objects or records. And you bind most often from properties in the environment. So usually from application properties or from a file that's imported from application properties. You can also bind to other things like maps if you want to use the classes that sort of power this thing directly yourself.
Okay, so in order to be able to make that data available to our controller, which we're going to create later, we'll start off by creating a hotel service, so a service layer in between. That service will provide logic, easy-to-use logic for the REST controller to call. And it'll have 3 methods. So it'll do a get all, which will give you all of the hotels. It'll have a find by name to give you the hotel data by name, and then find by geographic order. So it'll give you all of the hotels for that particular geographic order. Let's take a look at the hotel service class. As you can see, it maintains a list of all hotels, a map for hotels by name, and then a multi-value map, which I'll get to in a bit, for hotels by geographic order. The first thing that you see it's doing when it creates this hotel service, so it gets passed in the hotel properties bean, which we created using configuration properties. And it's using this assert.state to verify that the version of the file from the properties is 1, because the requirement from our project manager is that we only support file version number 1. So assert is a nice utility class that is available for you to use to assert, to validate certain data. And if it doesn't meet the requirement, it will throw an illegal state exception. The next thing that we have here is this map, which is maintained for hotels by name. And we want to be able to look up hotels in a case-insensitive manner. So Spring Framework has this linked hash map variant called linked case-insensitive map, which will be able to give you data in a case-insensitive manner. It still preserves the keys in its original form, though. And then I guess moving along, we have a list for all hotels. That's pretty straightforward. We have a multi-value map, which is again a class in Spring Framework available to you to use if you want to have a map which has multiple values per key. And the last thing that I wanted to point out here is this collection utils class, again, part of the Spring Framework, and it gives you some utility methods to be used with collections. You'll see a lot more of such utility methods peppered throughout this code base, which are all available in the Spring Framework util package. So we'll be covering some of them. And in this case, you can use collection utils to create an unmodifiable multi-value map. I think we can go back to the slides here.
Yeah, sounds good. So hidden treasure number 4, the assert class is, I'd say, is probably the most used utility in all of Spring internally. It's got a bunch of util methods that allow you to check that certain things are true or not empty, or most often not null. So we quite often use it at the start of a method to make sure you haven't given us junk. Most of the methods in it will throw illegal argument exception. There's the assert state method, which will throw an illegal state exception. And it also has supplier variants for performance. So if something, like if you say is true and you give it a false value, you can give it a message. If that message is something that will take a while to do, like concatenating strings, you can use a supplier variant, which is a bit quicker because the supplier only gets invoked if the assertion matches. I wanted to quickly point out that the JDK has got a very similar class now called objects. So we have a lot of code that uses assert, not null. The JDK has a lot of code that uses objects require, not null. And there is a subtle difference in them in that one will throw an illegal argument exception and one will throw a null pointer exception. And it's a kind of stylistic preference about which one you prefer. The JDK team think that the null pointer exception is better. The Spring team think that the illegal argument exception is better. And the reason we think of it that way is I tend to think of a null pointer exception as me, the author of that utility, has messed up and I've accidentally allowed a null through. Whereas a legal argument exception is like the user of the method has messed up and given me a null when they shouldn't have done. They should have read the Java doc. Number 5, case-insensitive map. There's not a lot to talk about this. It's a case-insensitive version of a map. It supports locale. The key has to be a string. It doesn't change the underlying values. And it works with all of the kind of related methods that you would expect as well. So like if you call keyset on that map, then that's also case-insensitive. MultiValueMap is a map with a key and then a list of values. There have been updates in the JDK that allow you to kind of do this relatively easily now without using the utils. But personally, I still prefer MultiValueMap if I'm working on a Spring app and I've got it available. It's used in framework to support HTTP headers. And this is the first of the utils classes that we're covering. Number 7, collection utils. We're going to cover a lot of these. All of them are pretty much the same. There's a utils class and a bunch of static methods that do stuff. Normally the methods are pretty well named. Everything's well Java docked. So in this case, I think we called unmodifiable multi-value-map. And we had an isEmpty method, which is quite useful if you've got something that may be null. So you probably used to saying like, you know, if list.isEmpty, but what if your list is null? Then you get a null pointer exception. Whereas if you use collection utils isEmpty and pass in the list, then it will deal with the null and you won't get a null pointer exception. It will say, yeah, null is empty. And there's a whole bunch of other useful methods that you should go and look at the class Java doc for. Back to you.
Okay, so I guess we can start creating the hotel controller now, which is going to be our REST API for listing the hotels that we were talking about so far. So it's pretty simple. The controller itself, it's a REST controller. It has a request mapping to the hotels path. And it's using this media type class that's again present in the Spring framework. It has a list of all common MIME types. As you can see, if I click on this, it'll show you that it's application/JSON, and there's a bunch of others in here that you can make use of if you're writing a controller and you want to specify what type of content the controller produces or consumes. We've injected the hotel service bean, and we'll use that bean in order to get the data from the hotel service. So instead of returning the entire hotel object as is from the controller, what we're returning is a hotel summary object. And I guess if I click into the hotel summary object, you can see it has a subset of some of the data that a hotel has. And to be able to create a hotel summary from a hotel object, we have this get method on hotel summary, and it makes use of this class from Spring Boot called PropertyMapper. We use it quite a bit within Spring Boot itself when mapping configuration properties to third-party classes, but you can use it in cases like these where you have a source object and you want to create a destination object from it. It has good support for nulls, so you can tell it whether you want to apply a certain value only when something is not null and things like that. Typically, you'll see it used using this from, as, and to pattern. So you can say PropertyMapper.from the hotel name. You can adapt it to something else and then set it on the resulting object. Another utils class that you can see here is StringUtils. It has, as you can imagine, various utility methods for working with strings. Here we're saying we want to capitalize the hotel name that we get from this hotel object. URI utils is another utility class available to you, used for encoding and decoding URIs. This is another method on StringUtils that we're showcasing here, which is collection to delimited string. So you can specify a delimiter. I think there's one which is like collection to comma delimited string. So if you want to create a string from a collection and it's delimited by commas, you can use that. And yeah, I think that's...
Can we have a look at the test very quickly for that one? I think we want to...
Oh yeah, for the hotel summary. So because this hotel summary gets returned from the REST controller, we want to make sure that it gets serialized properly into JSON. And so we wanted to write tests for the hotel summary. We have this JSON test annotation in Spring Boot that you can use to test that your JSON gets serialized and deserialized properly. It gives you a Jackson tester bean, which can then be auto-wired into your test. You can also use this Jackson tester directly using, we have this comment in here using init fields. And it has these methods to write JSON from an object and then make sure that the JSON is in the right, JSON is right, basically. And then it also has a read method to make sure that it can deserialize it properly. Here. Should we switch back?
Yep. Okay. For number 8, media type. It's a pretty useful class if you want to if you have controllers and you want to declare specific media types. You can use the constants that are in this class to save you peppering strings everywhere. It's also got some methods that allow you to compare media types. So you can have, there are various different ways of specifying things like application JSON plus error details, for example, and you can compare that to application JSON and pick the most suitable one. Number 9 is the PropertyMapper. As Madhura already said, we used a lot in Spring Boot itself to map from configuration properties to classes that configure things from libraries. It deals well with nulls, and as she pointed out, the general pattern is map from as to. You can apply common logic as well very easily if you always want to do the same thing to a bunch of properties. StringUtils, I'm sure everyone probably has a StringUtils. If you could do control show types of StringUtils, you'll probably find like 500 from every library that you've got has also got one. Well, Spring's got the best one, definitely. A bunch of util methods, capitalize, uncapitalize, starts with blah, blah, blah. You have to go read the Java doc if you want to know the full list. URI utils is another one that's very useful if you have to deal with URI encoding and decoding, which can be a surprisingly tricky topic. And then the final one we looked at here was the Jackson tester. This is a class that's designed to work with AssertJ. You can use it you can use the JSON test annotation if you're working with if you want to inject one. But you can also use it directly and just new one up and then use it to test methods. It's got helper functions as well, so you can give it like the name of a JSON file and it will go and look in the same package and see if it can find a file that's named that. So it can be helpful to get your tests free of bloat, because JSON, especially in early versions of Java, is quite hard to put in the tests. We have JSON and Jackson and the simple test version as well.
Okay, so we also said that this app was going to support an API for getting image thumbnails for some of the hotels, and we're going to add a controller for that. Actually, before I add the controller, I'm just going to show you that the app actually works because I don't think I did that. I do have this app running, and it does return all of the data in JSON format that we have for this. I'm hitting the all hotels endpoint, and then here I had the hotel by name, so I was using Flamingo. The name was actually Flamingo with an uppercase F, but because we use the linked case-insensitive map, we can get it in a case-insensitive way. And then this last one is for getting the images that are available, the thumbnails for the images. So let's look at that images controller and what it does. This one is quite involved because it's calculating the thumbnails on the fly. And let's see what we've got here. So again, it's like it's a REST controller, and what it returns is a resource for that image. We have a cache in this class, and in order to not have to compute the thumbnail on every request, if the thumbnail is computed, it's placed in the cache, and then if it's present in the cache, it's returned from the cache. Spring Framework has this class called ConcurrentReferenceHashMap, which is basically a variant of the concurrent hash map or the concurrent map. And it supports weak references. So it's useful for creating in-memory caches like these when you might be constrained on memory. Let's go through this method, which will give us our image. As you can see, it tries to get it from the cache first. If it's there, it's going to log a message. We're using this log message class from Spring Framework, and it's useful for resolving log messages lazily. If you need to format a log message, you can use logMessage.format. But if you have some kind of expensive operations that you want to do lazily, there's support for the supplier variant with logMessage.off. Another utils class here, which is file copy utils. It's basically copying the image into a byte array, and then if it's empty, if that byte array is empty, then we return a response status exception saying that the image was not found, that the image with the name that you specified in the request was not found. And if not, then we create a thumbnail at this point and return a new byte array resource. This is the first time that we're looking at a resource type from Spring Framework. So Spring Framework has this resource abstraction, which abstracts away the underlying resource from you. So there's things like classpath resource, byte array resource, file system resource, and the resource interface provides an abstraction over all of those for you. If we look a little bit at some of this code in the other methods, there's this class called ThrowingSupplier, which is interesting. It was added, I think it's added pretty recently in Spring Framework 6.
6, yep.
And basically it lets you, it gives you a supplier that can use to invoke code that throws checked exceptions. So if I look at like resourceutils.getURL, this one throws a checked exception, a file not found exception, but I can still use it in this Lambda method here. And I think those are all the utils that I wanted to show you in this class. Do we have tests that we want to look at here?
No, I think that was it.
Okay.
All right, so another recap. 113, Spring's resource abstraction is a very useful class. There's an interface called resource in spring.io, and then a bunch of implementations that you can use. It's also what gets used if you have like URL references or string references in some of your property files. It's got useful methods to get at the data, so you can get an input stream, you can get the contents quickly as a byte array or as a string, and get it as a readable channel. It also gives methods that get you access to the file if that's possible. So for instance, a file resource will obviously have access to a file, but a URL resource could have access to a file if the URL refers to a file. And classpath resources as well. The log message class can be useful depending on which logging framework you're using. So if you're using SLF4J, some of the pattern support will be less useful for you because you can just use squiggly brackets, I think, directly with that framework. But internally, Spring Framework uses Apache Commons logging, or a version of it. So it's very useful for us to have this log message format, which will take a format pattern and the arguments, and it doesn't get evaluated until that log is actually needed. So they did some performance testing and found that was pretty good and enough to allow us to get rid of all the kind of like is debug enabled, do this kind of methods that you quite often see in code. And there's a Lambda version as well, so logmessage.of takes a supplier that can return the string, so you can do anything you want. You don't just have to use the format version. Throwing functional interfaces, these are coming in 6. I found them very useful already. They're available for consumer, supplier, function, and by function. So you can either use them in your own APIs, which is nice because it allows people to call your API and not worry about the fact they're throwing a checked exception, or you can use it to make an existing API easier to use. So you can wrap something that throws a checked exception, and because a throwing supplier is a supplier, you can then pass that supplier on. By default, it throws runtime exceptions, but you can easily configure it as well. So you can say, I want you to wrap this thing, and if it throws any kind of checked exception, I want you to wrap it in legal state exception, legal argument exception, whatever. Pretty small here, but at the bottom of that slide, in the Git repo, if you want to go digging into that repo after this talk, the throwing functional interface example tests class has a bunch of examples kind of showing you how you can use it. Because we're a little bit tight on time, we won't go through that here. File copy utils is a useful util for copying files. One thing that's nice about it is it allows you to copy from input streams to various types. So I can say, here's an input stream, give me a string, or a byte array, or copy from 2 streams. Some of this stuff you might not need in later versions of Java because they've added default methods to input stream and output stream interfaces. But the class is still very useful. One of the nice features about it is it closes the stream once it's finished. So you can just do a call like file copy utils, give me the string, new file input stream, and then once it's returned the result, it's closed that stream for you. So you don't need to do try catches and all that. There is also a class called StringUtils, and if you dig into file copy utils, you'll see most of the methods there are like do something, close the stream, and the do something delegates often to StringUtils, which offers like similar methods, but they don't close the stream. So if you are like wanting to leave the stream open for whatever reason, use StringUtils. And as I've already mentioned, there's some default methods like read all bytes and transfer to in input stream that you may not need the file copy utils. ObjectUtils, again, another utils class, is empty, is array, null safe to string, null safe hash codes. The null safe methods are very useful if you're, as framework developers, we often have to deal with input that we want to be as relaxed as possible and not fall in a heap. So we quite often have things like null safe hash code where we will generate the hash code if the object is not null. And you should look at Java's objects class because ObjectUtils predates objects, but there's a lot of overlap now. And if you can get away with keeping to JDK utils, then that's obviously better because they're always going to be there. ConcurrentReferenceHashMap is an interesting class that we use a lot to cache things internally when we're working out, like Spring has to often go and iterate over a class and look at methods, and we use ConcurrentReferenceHashMap to keep caches of things that are expensive-ish for us to generate, but also things that we don't mind throwing away if memory gets tight. So the difference between this and like a regular cache is that you can use it with soft references, and if your memory gets tight on the machine, it will just happily throw away the contents of that. And the idea is that it doesn't matter because we can always recalculate it again. Oh, we have a bonus section. Is that it? We have 4 minutes and 20 seconds, so I don't know how much of this we're going to get through. I can show you some code, maybe. That makes sense? Yeah. So if you've used Spring for a while, you'll know that you can like inject things like a list of this type of bean or an object provider of this type of bean. And Spring has got to be able to look at all the bean definitions that are available and inject the right types. However, if you know anything about generics, you may know that that information isn't available in the object. So we don't know what types to inject all the time. And the reason we can do it is because we go back and look at the bytecode, and we use reflection to look at the method signatures. So there's a couple of interesting classes that I wanted to show you. I don't think I'm going to have time to show them all, but we can look at...
IntelliJ.
We can, oh my goodness.
He's an Eclipse user, and
yeah.
I have IntelliJ.
It's all right, I know what I'm doing. There we go. So this is an example of, oh, you've got your mouse is set to natural scrolling as well. This is going to be a nightmare. Oh my goodness.
I can show it.
What am I trying to show here? So here's an example where ResolvableType, basically you point it at the things that we can use reflection for. So for instance, here we're doing it on a field, and we're looking at the map here, and we're able to dig in and get generic information out of that. So if I've got here the MultiValueMap, for instance, which is a string and integer, and the ResolvableType is able to get that here as a map and then get information about it. So you can hear I've got, this is the type as it stands, this is it going up a level to a map, and then I'm able to tell things like I can resolve the generics, I know it's an integer, and I can resolve the generic on the nested type, and it's a list of strings. So I don't think we're going to be able to go through much more of that, but if you want to dig into those examples and run them, you can see some of the stuff, some of the hoops we've had to jump through. We won't cover this, but there's a project called Spring Java Format. If you want to apply consistent formatting to your projects, you can use it. And with that, I think we're done.
Yep. Thank you.